Okay, so let's start this third lecture in the course, and this lecture will be dedicated to graph theory. So, first of all, we will start with a riddle, and this riddle is the following: is the so-called 7 bridges of Königsberg. Königsberg is a city in Central Europe, and as you can see, this city is made by various land masses. One island, well, there are these rivers, and there is an island and 3 land masses around it, and there are bridges between these land masses. Now, in the Renaissance, one common pastime for people at the time was to try to see if they could walk through all the islands. Well, first of all, these are the bridges. So they wanted to see whether they could walk through all the islands, passing through all the islands and crossing each bridge once and only once. So this was a nice riddle. People could try it with their feet, basically walking around and seeing whether they could do that. Pretty healthy activity. But the question is that this riddle remained unresolved for many, many years. So the question that I want to ask you is, can you solve this riddle? So try to think for a few seconds. Can you find a way to walk through all the islands, crossing each bridge once and only once? For example, if I start from here, I can cross this bridge, go around, cross this other bridge, then go here, cross this bridge, and that's all fine. Cross this one, here, and then I get stuck in this island. So that doesn't work. So you can try another path. And you can go ahead with that. We can go ahead for quite a while. Did any of you find a way to cross all the bridges only once and go in all the islands? Okay, the problem that you might have noticed is that here there are a bit too many details. So you see, we don't really need to know all these details to address this riddle. So we can simplify this picture, and to simplify it, we can well, redraw it like this. So you see, in reality, this is 4 land masses, which we can call A, B, C, D, and 7 bridges between them. We can give it a go one step further and make it into just nodes of a graph, A, B, C, D, and links between these nodes. So this is the graph that represents, for what we care, the city of Königsberg. And you see now, well, if I ask you again the question on this graph, can any of you tell me if and how it is possible to cross all the nodes, well, to travel all the nodes of this graph, crossing the bridges or edges of this graph once and only once? Does any of you have an answer? You can unmute and answer if you want. Okay, so you can see, well, you can see it's not possible now. In the graph, it's very easy to see that. Why? Well, because if you want to go from a landmass, let's say C, out and come in again, and go out again and come in again, you can see that you need to have an even number of bridges. But obviously, C has 3 bridges, which means you can go in and out. Well, you can in once, out once, and then you are in and you're stuck there. So you basically can demonstrate very quickly that this is impossible. And this is essentially what Euler did in 1735, and basically said that each node must have an even number of edges if this riddle can be solved. Of course, this is a necessary condition, it's not sufficient. But that's not the point. The point is that since there are several nodes here with odd number of edges, this is impossible. So Euler demonstrated it's impossible, and by demonstrating this, well, he ended up a very nice pastime for people in Königsberg, but with that one stroke, he created 2 huge fields of mathematics, which I'm sure you have heard of. One is topology, and the other is graph theory. as a small diversion, Euler is one of the most prolificous mathematicians of all times. Just to give you an idea, he wrote I don't know how many papers. He was the founder of a mathematical journal in St. Petersburg, where he lived for the latter part of his life. And he filled all the journal for many years after his death, just to give you an idea. But this one is one of the most interesting and consequential finding of all his career. So this is essentially the idea behind graph theory, to represent something complex with a series of nodes and edges between them. So let's make some examples beyond bridges and landmasses. Social networks. Can you think of examples of social networks? Well, for example, well, of course, all of you can think of Facebook, Twitter, and so on, but let's go with something a bit less known. So first of all, there is the concept of sociogram, which was introduced about 100 years ago by Giacomo Moreno. And here the idea is the following. If you have a group of people, well, you have a classroom, for example, a class of some people, and you ask each of them who are your friends, which people you like, then you can create a graph like this, so that you know which people like which other people. And you can then find which are the people that are most important in this social network, because they are the ones that have most connections. So this is the concept of sociogram, introduced 100 years ago. A very nice example of a social graph is the following, the very well-known example of Zachary's Karate Club. So this is a study from the second part of the 20th century, in which a scientist was studying a karate club, Zachary's Karate Club, and this was a club with a lot of people, and around 35 people roughly. And these people were in the karate club. So of course, if I want to know the graph of these people, I can study the interaction between all these people. The problem is that in the karate club, everyone obviously was interacting with everyone else. So the graph would be fully connected, not very informative, because if everyone is connected with everyone, you cannot really distinguish different people in the karate club. So what this scientists did was to study which people were interacting with which other people outside the karate club, so socially. And he came up with such a graph. And you can notice here that there are like two groups, color-coded red and blue. And these two groups are very well connected between each other, but not so connected with the other group. The interesting thing, and the reason why this is such a famous example, is that Zachary's Karate Club at some point split into two because of some disagreement within the club. And what happened is that the people went into two different karate clubs, and they split exactly along the lines that define these two different communities in this network. So it was a very nice example, demonstration of the power of graph theory in understanding social relations. As another example, obviously, we can think about communication networks. Again, all of you can think of cell phones and so on. I will give two examples here, which are very interesting and subtly different. Try to think about what are the differences between these two examples. One could be a flight network. I guess all of you recognize, well, obviously all of you recognize that this is Europe, and maybe you also recognize the flight network of which airline this is. And you can see the European flight network of Air France KLM in this case. And here you see another communication network in Europe, which is the road network. These are the main roads that travel across Europe. As I said, both of them are obviously very naturally represented by networks. In the case of the flight network, the nodes are obviously the airports, and the edges are the flights between different airports. In the case of the road network, the nodes are the cities, and the edges are obviously the roads. And again, I said that there is a very subtle difference between them. Try to think about what it is. We will see that in detail later. Another example is food webs. So what can we say about food webs? Well, food webs is essentially a graph like this where you have different trophic levels. So you can start from the bottom, for example, where you have the most basic species in the food network, which is typically phytoplankton in bodies of water, and then you build from these basic trophic levels up towards animals that eat this phytoplankton, and then animals that eat phytoplankton, up to fishes, and then birds, and so on. So you see there are different trophic levels. One interesting thing here is that this is very naturally what we will call a directed network. What does it mean? It means that there is a clear direction in the connections. The direction is typically from, well, let's say, a certain phytoplankton is eaten by a certain zooplankton, and there is a clear directionality in the connection. It's not very common that two species of animals eat each other, or two species of living being. And one interesting thing is that this is a nice study because this was an experimentally observed food network in 1923, and the same environment was studied over the years, and over the years we can see that as time passes, the network becomes more complex, the food networks for the same environment. Why is it so? The reason is because we gain much more knowledge, and we can deal with much more knowledge about a given situation. So you see that there is a growth of complexity in the networks we study. Of course, this growth of complexity is not because the food network here is really more complex now than it was 100 years ago. It's because we know much more now about the food network than 100 years ago. But this is a trend that you will see in any graph theory study, where the complexity of our knowledge of networks in general becomes more and more, well, thanks to gains of knowledge, but also gains in computer power that permits us to analyze such knowledge. Okay, so how do we represent graphs? Obviously, a graph, as we have already seen, it can be represented by nodes, let's say A, and B, C, D, E. Imagine, for example, that these nodes are people in a social network, and then we ask A, whom do you like? And A can like everyone, for example. Then it has a direct connection from A to B, C, D, E, everyone. Then we can ask also B and C, whom do you like? And they can say we like A. And B can say also like C and D can say I like E. E can say also I like E and D like each other. So we have a nice directed network. So this is a directed graph because there is a directionality. We can, of course, well, this is exactly the same graph, but we can now give some weights. For example, we can ask people, how much do you like? Not only if they like someone else, but also how much they like this other person. So for example, A can be asked, how much do you like B? It will say 8, but for C will say 5. So we have a directed graph, but this time it's we can give obviously weights to every single edge, but in this case it will be weighted. So this is a binary graph. So the answer to the question, how much you, it's just a yes or no. And here we have a weighted graph where there is a quantity associated to the answer to the question. Of course, then we can create an undirected graph. So if we take this weighted directed graph, we can transform into an undirected weighted graph. How? Well, we can just forget the directionality and take the average between the two edges. So the strength of the friendship between D and E is 9. The strength of the friendship between A and E is 4 because the average is 8 and 0 and so on. So this will be an undirected weighted graph. And finally, we can also construct an undirected binary graph where the connections are like this and where essentially we forget about the strength. So we say whether there is some friendship or not. So this is an abstract representation of a network, but it's quite cumbersome when you go to a lot of nodes, and it's very difficult to deal with on a computer. So on a computer, typically you will use the concept of adjacency matrix. What is an adjacency matrix? It's a matrix which represents the connection between all nodes. So here you see you create a matrix with nodes A to E on both rows and columns. And then you ask yourself the question, whom does A like B? Yes. Does A like C? Yes. Does A like D? Yes. And so on. And so you fill all the matrix. So you see that this is obviously a matrix, and you can notice already something here. First of all, it's a binary matrix, zeros and ones. And you notice that the diagonal, it's zeros. What does it mean? Practically, the diagonal is 0. It means that in this graph, we don't have self-connection. It means that A is not, we don't consider self-connection, so A is not connecting to itself. There are obviously graphs in which you can have self-connections. If you want an example, for example, in the food network, food web, you will have a self-connection when an animal is cannibalistic, so can eat itself within the species. Okay, then how does it work with a weighted graph? Well, with a weighted graph, instead of having only ones and zeros, we will have numbers. So here will be zeros on the black cells, but the others will be numbers, 8, 5, 10, 8, and so on. Now we can have an undirected graph, weighted graph. Now, how does it work with an undirected weighted graph? Well, what happens now is that the graph is by construction symmetric, because obviously whenever there is a connection from A to B, there must be also the opposite connection from B to A. And again, we will have a weighted graph, so each one of these cells will have a certain number. And again, this is a symmetric matrix, which is a signature of the fact that this is an undirected graph. And we can obviously transform it into an undirected graph, binary graph, by thresholding it, so that wherever the value of the cell is different from 0, we set it to 1. And again, this is a symmetric matrix because this is an undirected graph. Okay, so now that we know how to build and how to represent a graph, what do we do with it? Well, what we want to do with it is to measure properties of the graph. And this means we can analyze some graph measures. Now, I will make another, so there are plenty of graph measures, hundreds of them. I will only mention a few that we will need in the second part of the class. And of course, the most important is the degree. And here, by the way, I will give examples based on a graph, on a brain connectivity network. I will not explain much about it because you will have a class by Mite-Mijalkov towards the end of the course, which will describe in detail how brain connectivity graphs are constructed and how they are analyzed. Here I just want to give you a teaser of that class, so I represent these measures on top of a brain graph. In any case, you all know, I guess, that your brain is a very complex organ with a lot of connection between different regions, and obviously the properties of this connection influence your cognitive abilities, and it's a very interesting topic of study. Anyway, in this case, we really want to know only what the measures we care about are. So let's start with degree. And of course, the degree is nothing else than the number of connection of a given node. So for example, if you take this node, we see that its degree is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7. So this node will have degree 7. So this is a very well connected degree, very high degree for this graph. On the other hand, we can consider another node, this one, and here we will have a very low degree node. So this practically means that this node is not well connected. So you see, we can easily calculate the degree of each node. In practice, if you have the adjacency matrix, the degree is nothing else than the sum along the rows or the columns of, if you think about a binary undirected graph, then you just sum the rows or the column and you get the degree of each node. Now, like this, you have the degree of each node. This is what we call a nodal measure. What does it mean, nodal? It means that it belongs to the node. Each node will have a different measure. But of course, you can take the average degree across the whole graph. So you take the degree of all nodes, you average it, and then you have an average degree, which is a global measure. So a global measure means that it's a measure for the whole graph at once. Another example of an important measure is the path length. So the path length between two nodes, let's say this node here and this node here, it's the minimum distance between these two nodes, measured as number of edges that you need to travel in order to go from this node to this node. In this case, the distance is 3, because the minimum number of edges that you need to travel to go from here to here is 3. Of course, you could, in principle, travel more edges. You could travel here, 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 I don't know, and keep on going around. So you have longer paths. This is the minimum path between two nodes. And then you have, so you can calculate the path length between two nodes. Then if you take one node, you can calculate the path length between this node and all other nodes in the graph. And, and then you have the characteristic path length for the given node. Now, you might notice that when you define a path length, there is a problem. I don't know if any of you notices that, but the problem emerges if the graph is not fully connected. Imagine that one node in the graph, like imagine that we cut these connections. Then you will have a graph made of two parts which are not connected to each other. This means that any node on this side will have, is not connected to nodes on the other side. This means that it's impossible to get to the other side. So the path length is practically infinite. Now, you see that there is a problem whenever you have infinite path lengths, because obviously, if you have an infinite path length, when you take an average, you get an infinite. So you see the problem. A single unconnected node is sufficient to mess up the path length, the characteristic path length of all nodes in the graph. So people introduce often the concept of global efficiency, which is to address this problem. Essentially, the global efficiency is the reverse of the path length. So instead of taking the path length between this node and this node, you take the inverse path length. So in this case, it will be 1/3. The advantage is that if you have some nodes that are not connected to the graph, the path length to those nodes will be 1/∞, which is 0, and it's a nice quantity to average. So you can get easily a consistent average and global measure of efficiency. Okay, and the other concept I wanted to introduce is clustering coefficient. So what is the clustering coefficient? The clustering coefficient, essentially, it's a measure of how clustered is a given node. What does it mean? So a node, it's clustered. Just to give you a concrete example, imagine yourself, you have some friends, and if these friends that you have are also friends with each other, then you are part of a cluster of friends, because you are all friends with each other. But if you are, then you have a high clustering coefficient for your friendships. If your friends don't really know each other, then you are in a low class. Your clustering coefficient of your friendships is low, because your friends don't know each other. So in practice, you see that how do we calculate this? Given a certain node, we look at the neighbors of these nodes, in this case 3 neighbors. And if there are 3 neighbors to this node, well, let's say this node has 3 friends, there are 3 possible friendships here, right? This could be friend with this could be friend with this, and this could be friend with this. But in practice, we observe that only these 2 are friends. So we have 1 out of 3 possible friendships or connections. So we have a 33% clustering coefficient. So we would say that this node is not very highly clustered. And we can even have a 0% clustering for a given node. For example, in this case, this node here, is connected to 2 nodes which are not connected to each other. So the clustering coefficient for this node is 0. Okay, and finally, we can think of hubs. Hubs are, well, somehow, the definition of hubs is not so mathematically clear-cut. Hubs are nodes that are important for the graph. What does it mean important? Well, depends. You can have, for example, nodes with a very high degree. So we can say nodes with a high degree are hubs. Why? Because they have high degrees, lots of connections. I mean, this you can probably you're thinking about the fact that hubs in flights network are the airport with a lot of connections. And they are important exactly because they have a lot of connections. So it's where the airlines organize around. Airlines typically nowadays organize their flights network around hubs where lots of flights come in and go out so that they can, with relatively few flights, reach a lot of destinations, having a connecting with one connection. So obviously high degree nodes are hubs, but another kind of hub can be also nodes that have a low degree but are very important for the network. So here you see that these nodes here can also be considered hubs. Why? Because these nodes link the left and the right part of the brain in this graph connectivity map. So they are very important because if this, let's say this and this node are lost, then the left and right part of the brain will not be connected to each other anymore. Well, let's say if these 2 nodes are lost and this is lost. So this will be so-called connector hubs. And their importance doesn't come from the fact that they are very high degree, but comes from the fact that they connect otherwise separated parts of a network. This is very important in many situations. For example, just to give an example from a completely different field, in social network has been shown that if you want to spread information to a social network, of course, the obvious thing is to spread it through high degree nodes because they will permit you to reach a lot of people in the social network, but they will only reach a certain cluster of people, a certain community. If you want to spread across community, then you really want to target the connector hubs, which might be people that are not particularly sociable in the sense they don't have lots of connections, but they have connections in different communities, so they can effectively spread information from one community to the next. And this is a very important concept. Okay, so see the time? Okay, so we can now introduce a simple mathematical concept, which is the concept of random graphs. And why do we want to introduce a concept or mathematical concept for graphs? Essentially because in this way, we can have a mathematical model that we can use to represent graphs and study them. So what is a random graph? Random graph is a concept, the simplest way you can model a graph. So how does it work? Well, before we even say that, they are sometimes called Erdős-Rényi graph. And Erdős was an extremely prolific mathematician from the 20th century, I would say almost competing with Euler, and introduced this concept some time ago in the second half of the 20th century. And the idea is very, very simple. A random graph is you take some nodes and you put random connections between them. So let's say you take each node and you give it 2 connections and tell the node to connect to whatever you want. That's a random graph. Another way of constructing a random graph is by constructing a random matrix like this one with a certain density. And if you want a binary undirected graph, obviously you will impose that it's symmetric, like in this case. That's it. So you see, it's a very, very simple concept. That's why it's a very powerful mathematical concept, because you can introduce it very easily and then study its mathematical properties. But from the graph point of view, what are its properties? First of all, the degree distribution. In a random graph, the degree distribution is going to be Poissonian. What does it mean, Poissonian? It means practically this. So here it's k, which is the degree of the nodes, and this is the probability that a node has that degree if you have a random graph constructed with random connections, or if you construct a random symmetric matrix equivalently. And you see that as changing the number of average connections, lambda, that each node has from 1 to 4 to 10, you have Poissonian distributions. That's it. Why Poissonian distribution are particularly interesting? What happens if lambda becomes larger and larger to a Poissonian distribution? So if we connect each node to more and more other nodes, it will go towards a Gaussian. So you know, Gaussian distribution is very important. You find it everywhere. So this is nice. So random graphs have Gaussian probability distribution when they have a lot of average degree. If their average degree is low, this is a Poissonian distribution. That's it. And then the second thing we would like to notice is other properties of the random graph. So here we represent a random graph on a circle. So each one of these points on the circle is a node, and we gave each node 2, 3 connections. So what can we say about this? How is its clustering coefficient? So please tell me what you think in this case. If you don't mind, write what you think about the clustering coefficient. Is it high or low in your opinion? So please write on the chat. Okay, that's good. You say low, and it is low. Why? Well, essentially because each node is randomly connected to other nodes. So if this node is connected with, well, let's take this one, it's connected to other nodes, chances are that those nodes are not connected to each other. So the clustering coefficient is low for a random graph. How is the path length? Long or short? Again, please write your guess. Well, in this case, you guess long, but it's short in reality. Why? Well, because you can go from one side to this, well, try to play with this, but you will see that if you put random connections between nodes, there is a chance that you can find a short path between them. Why? Because there are many ways you can go from one side to another. Try to think about that during the break. And so, please, well, think about 2 things then during the break. First of all, the path length of a random graph is actually short. And the reason is because, I mean, it's not unlikely that you find a path. Just to give you an idea, contrast this with the case of a regular graph, where you have a connection, only connection between the nodes on the circle. Then the path length will be really long between the average path length, because if I want to go from one side to the other of the graph, I would to go through all the nodes. With such construction, it's relatively easy to jump from one side to the other of the graph. That's why short. Try to think about that carefully. And think also about another thing, which is the following question: are random graphs good models for real graphs, like those from the examples we have seen before? Okay, so with this, I think it's good time for a break. If you have any questions, please ask me. You can either write or unmute yourself. So let's go now back to the question: are random graphs good models for real graphs? Do you have any answers to this question? And the best would be that you unmute yourself and you tell me what you think.
Yeah, so I'm gonna keep going.
Yeah.
So before you talked about some properties of the random graphs, and my intuition would be if those properties are fulfilled for the graph that we're trying to model, then that would be a good model.
Perfect. That's exactly what we are going to do. In fact, we are going to see whether real graphs have similar properties or not. So that's exactly the plan of the rest of the lecture. But yeah, what do you think? Do you think those properties are the ones of real graph or not? What's your opinion? I'm not checking the chat, so please just unmute yourself and give your answer if you want to answer.
I want to say that important properties of real graphs cannot be randomly reproduced by random graphs. So that's why random graphs are interesting when they don't reproduce some properties of real graphs.
Yes, and you're right. We'll see that in a moment. So obviously, there are some differences. So let's proceed then. It's nice that you thought about it. So let's go and look at the properties of real graphs. And just to think of real graphs, let's look at the real graphs you might have heard of, like the World Wide Web. What is the World Wide Web? It's a series of nodes which are essentially servers connected through connections, which are essentially the wires or wireless connections between such servers, typically optical fibers nowadays. So you have a worldwide network, and now the question is, for example, how are the degrees of this network? So what do you think? How it will be the degree distribution? If you remember, random graphs have a Gaussian degree distribution. And when people started to analyze the World Wide Web, they were expecting a Gaussian degree distribution. Why? Because they expected to be able to model it with a random graph. But what they found was this. So this is essentially the degree, well, this is a long time ago, 20 years ago, but this has not qualitatively changed. But what you can see here is that the degree of the servers in the World Wide Web is not a Gaussian. You see, this is a log-log plot with degree and a number of servers with that degree, and you see that this is well, it's a power law. You see that, and you see that because this is a line on this log-log plot. This was very surprising at the time, again, because people thought that they could model such graphs with random graphs. And this already tells you doesn't work, because the probability distribution of the degree is a power law instead of being a Gaussian. And then let's think of another example of a graph. Most of you might have heard of the web of co-acting. What is the web of co-acting? Essentially, you take any actor, like Al Pacino, and you check which movies he has made with other actors, and you can build a whole web of actors. Again, people thought this should be a random network because actors co-act with other actors more or less randomly. But what And you can essentially study this very, very precisely, because there is the Internet Movie Database with hundreds of thousands of actors. And when you calculate the average number of movies that each actor has, the average co-acting degree of an actor is in the order of 30, which means that each actor has co-acted with about 30 actors, which is not unreasonable if you think about it, because when you make a movie, around 30 articles, 30 actors will be there. Well, and then people thought, okay, this should be kind of a Gaussian centered around 30. But what it turned out to be, it's again a power law. You see that? So this is the degree. So how many actors you have co-acted with, and this is the probability, and you see that this is a power law. By the way, you see the power law. So why do you see the power law? Because this part here, the tail, it's linear. It doesn't really matter what happens at the beginning. This is obviously not linear, but we don't really care about small degrees. We care about large degree and how they scale, and they scale linearly, which tell us it's a power law. What does it mean, a power law? It means that a few actors have a lot of co-actors. So a few actors are very important hubs in this network, like a few servers in the World Wide Web are very important hubs in the World Wide Web. So, which also means that most actors, as you can see here, have really co-acted with maybe 1, 2, 3 other actors. So they really have few co-acting. So they've, well, maybe because they didn't do many movies. Let's go one step further. You can also think about the citation web. So by now you must have read a few articles, scientific articles, and you must have noticed that at the end of each scientific article there are citations to other articles. This also creates a web where each article is connected to other articles, and this tells us how, in a sense, how important is an article. The more citation an article has, the more important it is, because it has more, well, it has higher degree in the network of citations. Again, when one studies this network, one finds a power law. And this is an example where you see that there is a very clear power law on the tail, where few articles have a lot of citations, and the number of citations scales as a power law. Again, it's not random. This practically tells you that a few articles manage to accumulate most of the citations, and other articles don't get almost any, which is not what you will get if you have a random distribution of citations. Okay, so these are examples. Let's go now to the food web. What do you think in this case? So basically in the food web, you have, the food web means which species eats which other species. And the question that I have for you is, would you expect a power law also in this case? Please think about that. Would you expect a power law? By everything I said, probably the answer is yes. But if you actually look at it, you don't get a power law. You see that? I mean, this looks linear, but this is not a log-log plot. This is a linear log plot. So it's logarithmic in this direction, but it's linear in this direction, which means that even though here it looks like linear, it's not linear in log-log. This is not a power law. Okay? So this is more similar to a Poisson distribution, if you want, and something that goes towards, towards what we would actually expect in a random graph. And somehow, not exactly, but okay, the question that I have now for you is why? Why the food web is not a power law, and everything else we have seen, it's a power law in the degree distribution?
I mean, if you would have, if it's necessary to have features like hubs in order to have this power law, then that wouldn't make much sense in a food web, because that species that ends up being eaten by everybody would probably be extinct. Just a
yes, yeah, that's a good
random
point.
thought.
Yes, it's a good point actually. And any other ideas?
Is it maybe because primarily each animal has one main prey that they sort of prey on, so they don't have a very diversified diet?
Yes, that's a good point. So you're really pointing in the right direction. It's because in this case we have physical constraints. So in a food web, each species has its own ecological niche. So they live within this niche, which has some constraints in terms of physical constraints, but also ecological constraints. So typically, a given animal doesn't hit so many different species, focuses on some species. And if you are already eating many species, this doesn't make you more likely to eat any new species. So you see there are physical constraints. Just to explain a bit better the concept of physical constraints, let's compare the flight network that we saw before with the road network. So the question is, what do you think will be the degree distribution in these two cases? So I'm not sure how to ask. I would go by raising hands, but I will not see your hands. So let's write on the chat. How many of you think that both of these are power law distributions when we take the degree? Okay, let's start with the flight network. Do you think the flight network is going to have a power law distribution in the degree? Okay, it's all yes, that's good. Why? Does anyone want to say why? Well, you say yes, and it's correct actually. So it's a power law. So this is the probability distribution of degree for different airports. It's perfectly a power law. And the reason you are all pointing to the right direction. There is no real constraint. It's actually good for airlines to put a lot of flights on the same hub so that they can have an hub from which they can then make connecting flights. So it's naturally, there is no physical constraint. What about the road network? Do you think the road network will have a power law distribution? Okay, you say correctly no, and that's correct. And in fact, you get a very nice Poisson distribution when you make the degree of, in the road network, the degree for different cities or crossroads. Why? Any idea? Well, because if you look at it, there is a difference between road network and flight network, and the difference is that in the road network you have physical constraints. You cannot make a road that goes from here, from one side to the other of Europe, from Portugal to Greece, without crossing the cities in between. It makes no sense. While you can have a flight that goes from Portugal, from Lisbon to Athens without any problem. So the physical constraints is what permits, well, prevents the system from exploding and creating a power law. What does it mean exploding? Means that a given node cannot grow its degree beyond a certain number because it makes no sense, because then there will be other physical constraints preventing it. So someone asked, what about tunnels? Yeah, you can build a tunnel from Lisbon to Athens. Yeah, maybe, but would that make other people then build other tunnels from all other cities in Europe to Athens? Probably not. So even if you build a tunnel from one city to another, typically you want to stop in the intermediate cities. It's just too costly to create links. The point is this: the cost to create extra links in cities that are already well linked is too high. It makes no sense economically. Physical constraints, economical constraints. So, but anyway, the message here is the following. So what we observe here is that in networks that don't have physical constraints, some nodes tend to acquire more and more importance and develop a power law. And in networks that have some physical constraints, economical, physical, geographical, ecological constraints prevent the growth of a power law, so that nodes behave more similarly in degrees distribution to a random graph. So, okay, so basically with this we get to the first conclusion, which is that random graphs are not good models for real graphs. And to be specific, we can say that real graphs have very often a power law degree distribution, while random graphs have a Gaussian degree distribution. So that's the first observation. But you see that here there is number one, and that's because there is also another aspect of real graphs that is different from random graphs. And this is what is called small-worldness. So let's think about a social graph. So imagine that this is a group of friends spread all over the world, and you see this is someone's group of friends on Facebook, and now the friends of this guy are connected to each other. And what you can observe is that there are clusters, right? This Jordan here is at the center of the graph, but well, you see that there is a community connected to this person, then there are other communities. So this is a real world graph, social graph. What can we say about this graph in terms of clustering coefficient? So you remember, well, you remember probably that the clustering coefficient of a random graph is low, right? Now, how is the clustering coefficient of this graph, of this social graph, in your opinion? But you are correctly saying in the chat that is I. That's correct. Why is it I? Essentially, because typically groups of friends, there are communities of friends where people know each other. Your high school friends all know each other and they are friends with each other. So that this creates a very high clustering coefficient community. Very different from random graphs. And second question, path length. You remember we said in path length, we have so how is the path length here? So you're saying long. Why do you say long? Let's say I start from Jordan. Then I can go to Matt, and then I'm in contact with all this group at once. So it's actually a very short path length. So it's short. The slide is wrong. So we have a short path length in this case. And what I said before in the random graph was completely wrong, because in the random graph it's actually long. So you were right. So in this case, it's short. So what does it mean is short? Why is it short? So let's put it here. So someone is mentioning that the rule, okay, that's a good point. It's exactly where I wanted to go. Someone mentioned the 6-person rule, which says that if you take 2 random people in the world, you can go from the first to the second in only 6 steps. Why is it so? Well, the reason is the following. If you take a person, this person will have in principle some friends. Let's say you have a 1 person and this person has 100 friends. Then each one of this person will have 100 friends as well. Often they will know each other. And you repeat this a few times. What do you get? You get that starting from the first person, you go in 1 step to 100 person, 10 to the 2. In 2 steps, you go to 10 to the 4 person. 3 steps, you go 10 to the 6 person, 1 million. 4 steps, you get to 10 to the 4th step, you get 10 to the 8, which is 100 million. And 5 step, you get to 10 to the 10, which is already 10 billion in principle. Of course, there will start being overlaps. With 10 to the, in 6 steps, you can get to 10 to the 12, which is many more times the number of people that there are on Earth, which permits you to say that you are basically reaching everyone. This practically means you can, in very few steps, reach anyone. Just think about it. You probably don't know a lot of people in China personally, but as long as you meet one single Chinese person that lives in China, or even that lives here, and this person has a contact in China, well, you are 2 steps away from a huge community of Chinese people. And from there, you can easily reach all of Chinese people in 2 or 3 more steps. So that's a very nice concept, and that's exactly the concept of small-worldness. As we said, these properties are actually different. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I inverted the random graph and small world. So this should be long. So this is different from what random graphs are. So here you have the second property in which real graphs have high clustering and short path length, while random graphs have low clustering and long path length. Okay, so which ones are then better models than random graphs for real graphs?
I'm sorry, didn't we say it was short path length for the random?
I know, and I'm really sorry, but these slides are a mess. The point is this: random graphs have short path length, and so forget my slides. So random graphs have short path length and low clustering. Real graphs have high clustering and short path length. So path length is fine in random graphs, but the clustering, it's low, it's not high. The reason why random graphs have short path length, it's essentially the 6th degree of freedom, 6th degree of connection argument. Because in a random graph, if you take one person, connect to 100, then you take each one of these, connect at random with 100, and you do this 6 times, you get to 10 to the 12 people, which is more than the people in the world. Okay, so here it should be short path length for random graphs. So that's short, and in real graphs is also short the path length, what we observe in real life. And now we go to what are the better models for real graphs. And the first model, these both models were invented in the 90s. The first one is the so-called preferential attachment graph. And this model is the following. So let's say we take, sometimes it's called scale-free model. Saying scale-free or power law, it's essentially the same thing, because a power law, it's a scale-free function. So let's say we start from a very simple graph, like this one, 3 nodes all connected to each other. What we can do is to start adding new nodes. So here we add this one to this one by chance. And now this node increases its degree. But now in the next step, we add a new node, but we add it giving it preference for nodes that are already high degree. So each time we add a new node, we add randomly, but with preferential attachment. What does it mean, preferential attachment? It means that it attaches with preference to nodes that already have high degree. Okay, so that's the concept of preferential attachment. And you can imagine, so let's see it dynamically. This will lead to a power law degree distribution. I'm not going to go into the details of this. You can find it in the original paper, but it's a very simple mathematical argument in reality. The point is that you get automatically a power law degree distribution. So this means that in all natural and technological phenomena where you have a preferential attachment, then you can expect a power law. Now, I will keep on speaking. In the meantime, let's see a video in which you see, I didn't expect the music. I didn't expect, well, we can have the music, it's not bad, but just that then I cannot speak. So here you see how new nodes are being added to this graph and how it gets reconfigured as time passes. What you notice here is that nodes that are high degree tend to get more and more new nodes, so they become even higher degrees. And by becoming more and more high degree, they attract even more new nodes. So you see that you get naturally some few nodes that are very high degree and a lot of nodes that are very low degree. That's where the power law comes from. And so a few considerations here. First of all, we can see that the new node, the first nodes in the graph, obviously, are the ones that are have the more. It's very advantageous to be the first node in the graph because then you will grow faster than the rest of the new nodes. So basically, this somehow perpetuates the importance of the old nodes in a graph because they already have high degree, so new nodes will naturally attach to those. And this also creates a power law. And really, you observe this everywhere where having a high degree increases the chances that new nodes will connect to you and not to others. Just to give some examples, think about the flight network. Obviously, it's very convenient if you create a new flight connection to fly to an airport that has already a lot of connections, because then you can have a lot of connecting flights and fly to many other places. So in Sweden, it makes more sense to create a flight that goes to Stockholm instead of Gothenburg, because from Stockholm you can fly to many other places. This also means that the first airports that were created are the most important, even 1 century later. Why? Because are the ones that managed to grow more and therefore are the highest degree airports, and they can get many new connections, so they perpetuate their importance. Same thing for World Wide Web. If you create a new server, it's more useful for you to connect to another server which has a lot of connection instead of connecting to a server that doesn't have so many connections, because then the internet speed for you will be higher. Of course, you don't care about this when you use internet, but people that care about optical communications and lay down the optical cable that transmit information between continents worry about these things. It's very good to connect to hubs, servers that have a lot of connections already. Okay? On the other end, there are some cases in which having a lot of connection is just not convenient. Think of the food web. If a species is predated by a lot of predators, it's not really convenient for a new predator to predate on that species. It's much better for a predator to find out their own ecological niche where they predate on something which is not so much in demand by many other species. So you see that in that case, you have a kind of anti-preferential attachment. And that's what prevents a food web graph from becoming a preferential attachment graph characterized by a power law. Same thing for the roads. Well, for the road network, if you want to build a road, you don't really think about building a road between the cities that are best connected. So in Sweden, typically you will not think about making a road between Stockholm and Gothenburg directly. Probably you will think about making roads between, I don't know, 2 small cities between Gothenburg and Stockholm. So you see that the dynamics are very different when you have or you don't have preferential attachment. In any case, so preferential attachment is one of the most important concepts in graph theory, and was invented by Barabasi and Albert in 1999. By the way, this paper is incredibly cited, as tens of thousands of citations. Just to give you an idea what that means, many scientists do the whole career and they don't reach 10,000 citations across all their papers. This paper alone has 30,000, 40,000 citations in a few years. So that gives you an idea of how important and transformative was this discovery. Because people could for the first time understand what is the mechanism that leads to the emergence of power laws observed in real graphs. And of course, this means that random graphs are not good for that. So this explains the degree distribution we observe in real graphs. Here, but this doesn't explain the clustering and path length of real graph. So let's go over it and let's fix the ideas. So we have random graphs. So here we see, this is exactly the random graph that I showed you before. You see that there are nodes distributed around the circle and random connections between the nodes. And here we have a regular graph where we have nodes distributed around the circle and they are regularly connected to each other. Now, let's fix the ideas correctly once forever. Okay, let's first see that we can interpolate between these two cases. So if you take a regular graph and we remove some connections and rewire them randomly, we can have what we will see is a small world graph. Now, this can be parameterized by a parameter p, which goes from 0 for regular graph to 1 for random graph. And basically, as p goes from 0 to 1, we increase the randomness of the rewirings. Okay, so in this case, we are in an intermediate stage where we have just made a few rewirings. Now, let's fix the ideas very carefully. So in random graphs, as we should have seen, we have, so here you see, this filled dots represent the path length. So this is the path length of the graph normalized to the path length of an equivalent random graphs. What does it mean? An equivalent random graph means a graph, essentially a random graph with the same degree distribution. So here you see that for a random graph, the path length is short. And this is correct. So please forget and forgive what I said before. So you have a short path length for a random graph. And here you have the open symbols that represent the clustering coefficient, again normalized. And you see that the clustering coefficient for a random graph is very low. Why? Because randomly, the nodes that are neighboring a certain node will not be connected to each other. Okay? So we see what happens on the random graph side. Regular graph side, well, the path length is now very large. Why? Very long. Essentially because if you want to go from here to here, you have to cross a lot of nodes. You cannot, there is no shortcut. So the path length is long. This one. And the clustering coefficient on the other end is very high. Why? Because it's a regular graph, which practically by definition means that these two nodes are connected to each other. And well, this node is connected to these two, and these two are connected to each other. So they create a local cluster. So the clustering coefficient is very, very high. In this case, yeah, you see that the clustering coefficient is so high that you get close to 1 for a regular graph. Now, what is very interesting is with a small world, because what you see is the following. When you start rewiring a few of these connections, just a few of them, well, the clustering coefficient doesn't change too much because you're just changing so few of them that it doesn't matter. So the clustering coefficient doesn't really change until you rewire really a lot of the connections. And by a lot means like 10%. So if you rewire one connection out of 1,000, 2,000, one out of 100, the clustering coefficient is still very high. But as you start rewiring, just rewiring a very few connections permits you to create shortcuts from one side to the other of the network, like you can see here. And this, these shortcuts reduce the path length enormously, very, very quickly. So very few rewiring permit you to push down the path length a lot. So you get to this situation, intermediate situation, where you can have a very high clustering coefficient, but very low, very short path length at the same time, which is similar to what you have in real world network. So like the network of your friends, because, or the social network around the world across all people, because you just need to meet one person from China to become much closer to all Chinese at once. So it's very, very efficient. So very few rewiring permit you to push down the path length very quickly and very efficiently. Okay, so this is another work which was done by Watts and Strogatz, again, late 90s. And also this one, very successful and known work. I think the number of citations of this is, I don't know which one between this and the previous one is higher, still in the order of 30, 40,000 citations. So really these two papers are the two papers that created the network theory revolution and the huge interest that there's been in the last 20 years in network theory and the study of graphs. And the reason is because they explain how you can get models, mathematical models for networks whose properties are similar to the ones you find in nature. Specifically, a degree distribution which is power law, and a small world organization where you can have high clustering but short path length at the same time. Okay, so this is the point. High clustering and short path length is what we observe in nature and in technological phenomena, and what this model of small world permits to reproduce. Okay, with that I will finish the class. And of course, if there are questions, please unmute yourself or write them in the chat. So if you have any question, please just ask.
I have a question.
Yes.
So these things that we went through in the lecture were more describing the nature of the networks or graphs that we are experiencing in the real world and random ones. Are there some applications for how we are going to use this sort of information by visualization? Do you have examples of where we can use this information?
You mean in the course or in practice?
In practice.
I mean, you use them. I'm not sure what you mean by use.
For example, for the brain, there is discussions about, as you showed in the beginning, to map the brain with the nodes and having the graph topology for it.
Yes.
So I wonder if it's just for understanding the brain and describing.
There are actual applications. The good thing about the brain is that you will have a full lecture about that by a specialist, Dmitry Mijalkov. But I can already tell you, for example, for the brain, one interesting thing is that what has been observed is that the brain of healthy people has a small world organization and a power law organization in the degrees of the nodes. So it's really not a random graph, it's really a graph that has the properties I described at the end of the lecture. And what has been also observed is that when there are neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer or Parkinson and so on, there is a breakdown of, so basically the brain network becomes less small world. So it loses part of its small-worldness. And that can be also used in practice to measure and as a marker of neurodegeneration, if you wish, so that people can use it to predict the evolution of Alzheimer in a certain patient or to detect it. So this kind of application there are. Also, it's very interesting, obviously, in basically all network science fields from telecommunication to social sciences and so on are using these tools on a daily basis to understand how real networks work. I've not spoken about many aspects of network science, obviously, that are very interesting. One of them is, for example, the study of a network in terms of resilience. So the question there is, how resilient is a network to attacks? So if I remove some connections or some nodes from a network, will this mess up the network completely or not? And what properties of the network prevent the network from make the network more resilient? You can imagine this is an extremely important topic, for example, in electric grids, especially when you go to smart grids, because you want to be sure of what happens when, I don't know, a power line or a power station goes down. So there are all these applications, and of course there is a huge amount of research in those directions and application engineering, real engineering. And yeah, so
Thank you.
that gives you a feeling, but it's really, as I said, these papers have been cited 40,000 times each, which probably doesn't tell you too much but it's really a lot of citations, which means that a lot of people have used the tools of network science in many different fields to do other things. Okay, is there any other question? Okay, so